All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Evan Stankovic, adult programming librarian at the Northside Library. And on behalf of the Jefferson Madison Regional Library, we welcome you to the virtual program, What's a New Negro? Portraits at Northside Library with Professor John Edwin Mason. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and please do remember to keep checking jmrl.org for a complete and frequently updated schedule of programs and events for all ages. This event and all JMRL events have been made possible by the incredible and generous support of the Friends of the Library. This program is also being recorded for inclusion on the JMRL YouTube channel. So if you'd like to rewatch this event or have a friend who couldn't attend this evening, barring any technical issues, we hope to have this recorded and posted within the next couple of days. As a courtesy, we ask that all questions please be saved to the designated Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. You can type questions into the Q&A or the chat box, and we will attempt to address as many as time permits. Additionally, the closed caption transcript has been enabled for this evening's program. You can activate this feature by selecting Live Transcript at the bottom of your screen and enable subtitles. Please note, despite the prompt you might receive, you cannot save or download the transcript, and the transcription is by no means flawless. With that said, before I introduce Professor Mason, I'd like to take a moment to personally thank him. First of all, for co-directing the Holzinger Portrait Project, curating this incredible exhibit, and sharing it with the Northside Library, where these amazing and beautiful photographs adorn the length of our hallway. The exhibit at the Northside Library was a long time in the works, originally scheduled for March of 2020, but canceled owing to the outbreak of the pandemic. We are grateful that it all came together, and I strongly encourage anyone who has not been to the Northside Library in the last month to please stop by within the next couple of days. They will be on display until probably Friday afternoon, we're thinking. So definitely Wednesday and definitely Thursday. And again, this is just a small portion of the exhibit, and Professor Mason will explain the larger scale exhibits coming on later in the year. So please do plan to stop by the library. And Professor Mason, thank you again for showing this exhibit. It's been beautiful out there and very highly received. So documentary photographer, musician, motorsports enthusiast, and historian, Professor Mason teaches African history and the history of photography at the University of Virginia, in conjunction, of course, with co-directing the Holzinger Portrait Project. Here to discuss the subject, What's a New Negro? Would you please help me welcome Professor John Edwin Mason?
Thank you very much, Evan. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk about the Holzinger Portrait Project. And, you know, in some ways, the Holzinger Portrait Project is part of a series of projects that are going on in the city of Charlottesville that are re-looking at the history of this city, that are looking at parts of our history that we have ignored, parts of our history that we have forgotten. And I want to give a special shout out to the Jefferson School African-American Heritage Center, which is a terrific hub of historical investigation. They're also a partner in the Holzinger Portrait Project. I also want to give a shout out to the revitalized Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society, which they're going to be doing some really great things. And there are various projects at the University of Virginia that are also contributing to local history. So I just want to say that the Holzinger Portrait Project is not alone, but we think that the exhibitions that we're going to be holding in a few months, starting in September at UVA, and then in early 2023 at the Jefferson School, we think these are going to be some really significant new ways of seeing Charlottesville's history. And by seeing Charlottesville history, I mean literally to see with your eyes, but also to see in the sense of understanding, because we're taking a new entry point into the history of the city. So I want to do one thing before I start, and that's to start my timer, because I am a professor and we do like to talk. Okay, so I've got a PowerPoint for you because I've got lots of pictures. And so, Evan, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself and just confirm that you're seeing the PowerPoint.
Yes, it looks perfect.
Okay, that's great. Okay, what's a new Negro? The entire talk is going to be sort of explaining that. It's complicated, actually. In fact, it's more complicated than I thought even a month ago. The work in researching these portraits and the historical context of these portraits is ongoing. We're learning new things every day, literally. And if I had to give the exhibition at Northside Library a title, I might give it a slightly different title if I were doing it now rather than 5 weeks ago. Well, I said that this is a project that involves a whole lot of people, and I'm not going to read out their names, but you can see that we've got help from the Jefferson School, from the UVA libraries, from IATH, the Institute for Advanced Technology and the Humanities, various UVA sites, and we've got community advisors. We really want to bring the community into this project, and we want the community to help guide us as we move along. And we're really grateful to have two people who are both embedded in Charlottesville, deeply embedded in Charlottesville and its history. They also have ancestors who were photographed by the Hallsinger studio. And so that's really exciting that, you know, we can see their ancestors. We know their ancestors visited the studio and had their portraits made there. So we're doing a lot of things in this project. And I came across this quote by Rebecca McGinnis, who longtime Charlottesvillians probably know. She was a teacher at the Jefferson School and lived till well over 100 years old. Now, this is an interview that she gave back in 1990, and she's talking about history, and she's talking about what she knows that the younger generation doesn't. And she knew the hardships, right? She knew having to sit in the back of a bus. She knew having to go around back to get your food when the restaurant wouldn't serve you. And she's worried that youngsters can't see that they don't know these things. They don't know what the previous generation has been through. And a lot of what we want to do is to bring the story of the older generation, their ancestors. We want to bring this to the new generation, but we want to bring it in a way that starts with these portraits. You know, a lot of the conversation about history in Charlottesville has been about acknowledging the tremendous role that racism and white supremacy, Jim Crow segregation and slavery played in shaping our city and our region. I don't just mean Charlottesville, because we're very concerned with Albemarle County. Many of the people in the photographs were Albemarle County residents, and even Nelson and Greene and Louisa County residents. So it's the history of the region, really, that we're interested in. And, you know, because of the controversy over the statues, the Confederate memorials, we are in the process of seeing how deeply slavery and segregation shaped this city. And those are entry points into history. But our entry points are different. And our entry points begin with people like the Ferguson family. Now, many of you know that Dr. George Ferguson was the first African-American physician to practice permanently here in Charlottesville. You may not know that he was a political activist. He was very prominent in the Republican Party. Remember, the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln, and African Americans associated the Republican Party with emancipation, with freedom. African Americans were members of the Republican Party well into the 20th century. Now, George Ferguson had to leave the Republican Party because they threw him out, and they threw out many African Americans. The Republican Party in around 1920 went into a lily white phase and discouraged African Americans from participating. But up until that point, he was not only active in Republican Party politics, he was a voter. We don't think about African Americans voting in this period. The little boy is George Jr., and he grows up to be a civil rights activist in the 1950s with the NAACP here in Charlottesville, and was instrumental in the desegregation of Charlottesville schools. We can talk about people like the Reverend John C. Now, the Reverend C is not famous. but he's representative of a history. He's a representative of a history of what African Americans were doing despite the oppression, building lives, building institutions for themselves despite the oppression. And people who insisted they were not defined by oppression. They were not defined by the way that white people saw them. They were not defined by the law that classified them as second-rate citizens. No, they had other kinds of lives. And the Reverend C, we know that in part of his life, he was a laborer at the chemistry department at UVA. And we don't know exactly what he was doing, but we certainly know he wasn't a professor, and he was probably sweeping the floors and cleaning the test tubes. But in his other life, he was an ordained minister and had a church out in the county. You know, people like Marie Gordon, she's holding her diploma. It was pretty common for graduates of high school and middle school to dress in white and have their portraits made by the Hallsinger studio. The wonderful thing about this particular portrait is that if you blow it up, you can see that it's her 8th grade diploma from the Jefferson Graded School. And you're asking, well, why does she have a diploma from the 8th grade? Because in Charlottesville, Black children could not go to high school. There was no high school for Black children in 1915. And in fact, there was a campaign within the African American community for a high school, and a long-running campaign, and they sweated blood to get a high school. They finally opened in the mid-1920s. Before that, if you wanted to go to high school, you had to go out of town. Many children did, but it was a real burden financially on their parents. And of course, who wants your 14, 15-year-old to go off and live away from home? So the campaign for a high school, people like Burnett Watson, who served his country during World War I, and like many veterans, Black and white, came back home and had his portrait made in uniform back here in Charlottesville. Families like these, the Hawkins, they lived out around Keswick. We know some of their descendants are still in the area, and people like Harvey Foster. Now Harvey Foster's picture allows me to talk a little bit about the technology that the Hallsinger studio was using. They were making their photographs on glass plates, actually clear glass plates that you had to coat with a photosensitive substance. And the glass plate was pretty big. It was about 5x7 typically. Some were a little larger, 5x7 typically. And to make an image like this, what you did was you masked one side, put a mask over one side of the glass plate and made one portrait. And then you put the mask over the other side of the portrait, of the glass plate, and you could make a second portrait. So we have 2 portraits of the same guy. And what this does, besides showing us the technology, is showing us how self-conscious African Americans were. In fact, everybody who went to the studio was very self-conscious about how they presented themselves, how they dressed, how they wanted to be seen. And Foster here, clearly he's wearing his work clothes over on the right. Now, why he's wearing his work clothes, we have no idea. But for him, this is part of his identity. This is part of who he is, but it's not all of who he is. And so over on the other side, he's a dandy, he's a city slicker. He's looking really cool. And so there's a second presentation where, he's dressed in a way that shows that he's stylish. I don't know the slang that they would have used, but he's cool, he's hip, and he's trying to create this identity that is not simply imitating white middle class ideals of propriety and dress, etc. Well, you got all these interesting things going on within the African community and African American community, and we were looking for a way to talk about all of them. And I've got one more slide to show you. There were lots of black businesses in Charlottesville, and we did not know that this was a black business until somebody, I can't remember who, told us, you got to look very closely at that sign. And if you look at the sign, you see the Southern Aid Society. The Southern Aid Society was a mutual aid insurance company. It was founded in Richmond in the 1890s and eventually grew to be the largest African-American owned insurance company in the entire nation. Well, there we have. Mr. Taylor was in fact the agent for the Southern Aid Society. And so as I was saying, we've got evidence of all kinds of interesting things going on in the African-American community, and we're looking for an umbrella to talk about it all. Well, we found our umbrella in the Daily Progress, a story that you can't really see, but it's on the front page and it's up there at the top. And sure enough, it talks about the new Negro. Now, this is an article that was published in the Charlottesville Messenger. That's an African-American newspaper that was published weekly in Charlottesville. Very few copies of it remain. It's very hard to find. So we're lucky that from time to time, the Daily Progress reprinted articles that had first appeared in the Messenger. And so this one was written by George W. Buckner. Now you can see it says George W. Buckner of St. Louis. No. He was born and raised in Charlottesville. He was from a very prominent African-American family. He had gone to Hampton Institute. He came back to Charlottesville to teach, helped his father run his father's grocery store. But then he did then move to St. Louis. But he was a born and bred Charlottesvillian. And he's talking about the new Negro. Now, it's a little hard to read there, so I'm going to show you another slide. So he's saying the new Negro all over the country is coming to see that his salvation is in his own hands. The new Negro was a nationwide phenomenon. That phrase was in use all over the country. And Buckner is really putting his finger on how new Negroes saw themselves. Thank God the pussyfooting Me Too boss hat in hand Negro is gone. That is why we are termed new Negroes. And he goes on. The new Negro wants in Charlottesville teacher salaries based on service, not color. You may know that African-American teachers were paid less than white teachers. A four-year high school, you see. Representation on city council, Jim Crow streetcars abolished, representation on the school board, better street facilities in Negro districts, by which he means sewers and paving in Negro districts, in African-American neighborhoods. You know, those don't seem radical, right? But just publishing that essay on the front page of the paper set off a firestorm within the white community. The white community was outraged that African-Americans, at least one of them, had the audacity to be so uppity and to be so demanding. And a firestorm, like I say, came down on the head of the publisher of the Messenger, and I'll come to that in a second. This is George W. Buckner's father, A.J. Buckner. A.J. Buckner had been born into slavery and became prosperous and a grocer in town. And the little girl is George W. Buckner's daughter, AJ's granddaughter. So the idea of the new Negro, it was, like I said, it was nationwide. And, you know, people who are into African-American studies know the name Elaine Locke. Locke was a philosopher, was an art impresario, a writer, and he wrote the classic statement about the new Negro, published it in 1925. You notice that's after Buckner. Buckner was in 1921. The younger generation is vibrant with a new psychology. A new spirit has awakened the land. The day of aunties, uncles, and mammies is equally gone. Uncle Tom and Sambo have passed on. You can see how that language resonates so much with the way that George W. Buckner was talking. And Elaine Locke goes on, we are achieving something like a spiritual emancipation. This sense that something new was happening in the African-American community, was really profound and really deep, and he found it in all kinds of other places. So Marcus Garvey, famous for his Back to Africa campaign, the Southern Negro now feels that he has a part to play in the affairs of the world. A new light is burning for our brothers at this end. That means in the South. So the notion of new Negro in Charlottesville helps us understand a lot of the energy, a lot of the organizing, a lot of the creativity of the African-American community at this time. And it also connects it to national history. And we love that connection to national history. But I was talking about a firestorm, and there was a firestorm. The editor and publisher of the Charlottesville Messenger, the African-American newspaper, was John Shelton. John Shelton was in a very vulnerable position. John Shelton was the principal of Albemarle Training School. Now, that was a public school for African Americans, and it really was a training school. It was, you got basic literacy, in the basic education, but were training also for manual labor. But and in any case, it depended on public funds, and it depended on the goodwill of the white community. And Shelton knew that, having called down this firestorm, he probably had to do something to put the fire out. And what he did was to write an editorial for his paper, the Charlottesville Messenger. And now it's appearing once again in the Daily Progress. And he backs away. He absolutely backs away from what George W. Buckner said. And so you can see him here. In publishing this article in question, we assume no responsibility for the writer's views. They're peculiar to himself. In fact, the very title of the article was not, there's a typo there, was not a compelling one to us. As we know, no such animal in these parts, no such animal as the new Negro. Well, that's kind of humiliating. And, you have to wonder why he pulled back so far. Having clearly stated our position, we'll consider the incident closed and bid farewell to the so-called new Negro. Well, I'll tell you, one of the reasons that he backed away is he was under a lot of pressure. I'll give you an example. So the Daily Progress, after publishing that article by George W. Buckner, published a retort. And you can't read the headline up there very well, but it says, "Misleading the Colored Race." And here's what they have to say: "The circulation of such absurd tirades and impossible proposals as this argument contained only serve to make the problem of law-abiding and respected element among the colored people that much harder." Basically saying this foolishness is just going to cause problems for Black folks. And African Americans understood that there could be a lot of problem if you got white people upset. So, of course, almost everybody in this region knows about the lynching of John Henry James in Albemarle County, right about where the entrance to Farmington Country Club is now, although I hasten to say Farmington Country Club did not exist at the time. But it's right there where Farmington is. 1898, this lynching has been commemorated, and soil from the lynching site has been taken down to the lynching memorial down in Montgomery, Alabama. But it's not the only lynching in these parts, no. So this is the lynching of a 14-year-old, Andrew Bailey, in Afton, right near the Albemarle County, Nelson County line. Now, he was accused of a heinous crime. He's a child. The newspapers say that he was 14. Jane Smith, a really fabulous local historian, has gone to the census records, and she's found that he was probably 12, probably a 12-year-old boy lynched in 1904. And then there was the attempted lynching in 1917 of Robert Jones and Ham Crosby. That happened right downtown, right outside the old jail. Huge mob, They were accused of murdering a policeman. It's not clear whether or not they actually did it, but the lynch mob really didn't care. So Charlottesville citizens started the crowd down there at the courthouse, and a large contingent of UVA students marched over. They were all clamoring for these men. They wanted to take them up and string them up from a tree. The local law enforcement basically stared them down. Nobody was willing to possibly get shot simply to lynch these guys. So they were spared at the moment, but they were very quickly tried and convicted and hanged. And but it was this attempted lynching. This is a period in Charlottesville history where violence and the threat of violence is very, very real. It's just going to be a few years later where the Ku Klux Klan reconstitutes itself in Charlottesville. And this is history that we've also learned recently, relearned during the Blue Ribbon Commission hearings, that the Ku Klux Klan in Charlottesville included some of the most prominent businessmen and professionals in the city. That's what the Daily Progress said when it reported on the reconstitution of the Klan in a moonlight ceremony at Thomas Jefferson's grave. So, if we want to know why Shelton backtracked, part of the story is that he needed to keep his school open and he needed to keep his community safe because the threat of violence was always there, mob violence. But I think there's also an element that involves Booker T. Washington and involves a different kind of interpretation of the New Negro. So you can see here in this book that Booker T. Washington published in 1900, he's using the New Negro in his very title, New Negro for a New Century, published in 1900. And Booker T. Washington, of course, is known to be quite conservative. And his idea of the New Negro was different from George W. Buckner's. One of the things that's really, okay, I'll get to this in a second. So the book is rightly named The New Negro. The New Negro of today is advancing further, is in every phase of life, far advanced over the Negro of 30 years ago. And so in the following pages, you're going to meet these progressive and much more advanced African Americans. I was going to say that one of the interesting things about this book is that he tells the story of representative African Americans who have done well. So we have here, graduate of Oberlin University. He's using portraits. He's using portraits to tell the story. I mean, text is important, but the book is full of portraits. He wants people to see a different kind of African American. He wants white people to see a different kind of African American than they imagine. That for him, words are important, but so is photography. And we're going to see that the African American community has used photography as a weapon of social justice for a very long time. But for Booker T. Washington, to be a New Negro was not to press for political rights. To be a New Negro was not necessarily to embody this energetic new psychology that Elaine Locke was talking about. To be a New Negro was to show morals, industry, self-restraint, to organize society, but also to do things that kind of surprise us, to draw lines, social lines between the decent and indecent within the African American community. His sense was that Jim Crow is untouchable, that segregation is a reality, that African Americans have to learn to live within the circumstances that life has given them. And so we turn inwards and we build up our own morals and industry and self-restraint, and we separate the upright from the lascivious, the moral from the immoral. It was about creating strength within the African American community, but at the same time, rejecting agitation, accepting Jim Crow, accepting his critics would say, accepting permanent second-class citizenship. And Shelton thought along these lines too, right? And so this is 1911, so this is a decade before that firestorm over the new Negro. And this is something that he published in the Charlottesville Daily, the Charlottesville Daily Progress once again quotes him in something that he'd written for his own newspaper. The colored people of Charlottesville have every reason to congratulate themselves on the kindly spirit and pleasant relations which exist between the races in this city. We from time to time hear much about the Negro problem. So far as Charlottesville is concerned, such a problem as applied to the races is but little in evidence. Wow. I mean, I've already talked about 2 lynchings and an attempted lynching. You can only imagine what else is going on. It's surprising. It's really quite surprising. So this is the issue of the Daily Progress, or part of the front page of the Daily Progress, when it quoted that thing that I just read from Shelton. Okay, so on the same front page, if we go over 2 columns, we see the Glee Club concert, and it's clipped from here. But if you read far enough down in this description of a concert by the UVA Glee Club, you find that part of the show was blackface minstrelsy, that they did an entire program there, or a segment of their program, where the boys dressed up in blackface and they mimic and mocked African Americans. And then if we go all the way over to the right, we see that the daughters are active. Who are the daughters? Well, the daughters are the UDC. Who's the UDC? The United Daughters of the Confederacy, the people who were so instrumental in making those Confederate memorials possible, working, of course, with McIntyre, Paul Goodloe McIntyre. And also they were really at the heart of creating and propagating the myth of the lost cause, this understanding of the Civil War that dismissed slavery entirely and painted the slave-owning South in the rosy glow of nostalgia. You know, they were really, they were promoters of the Confederacy. So you've got Shelton over there on the left talking about how great this place is for Black folks. And then you've got a minstrel show in the UDC over there on the right. It is really a complex and fascinating time in Charlottesville history. I'm going to go really fast through this because a couple of minutes ago my timer went off and said that I've got to speed up. These photographs, as I'm going to tell you in a few minutes, are direct, overt, and self-conscious contradictions, challenges to the visual culture of white supremacy. This visual culture was deeply embedded in American culture and long predates photography. So Jim Crow, where does the name Jim Crow segregation comes from? It comes from one of these characters from blackface minstrelsy. There was Zip Coon, another standard character in blackface minstrelsy. There's, of course, the African-American Mammy, so familiar to us. UVA and Charlottesville participated in this national culture that denigrated African Americans. So this is from Corks and Curls, 1922, the University of Virginia yearbook. This is also from Corks and Curls, 1922, the University of Virginia yearbook. The African American character over there on the left, you can see the razor coming out of his pocket. Same Corks and Curls. Well, you know, the Klan had been reconstituted in Charlottesville in 1921. There was a branch here at UVA, and they didn't hide it. The Klan even made a donation to the University of Virginia, which was accepted. Daily Progress. Daily Progress routinely published cartoons like this about African Americans. And even within the Hallsinger studio archive, we see that. This is just an advertisement that appeared in Quirks and Curls. The studio was the largest in Charlottesville. It was owned by R.W. Hallsinger. He's the guy who's sitting in the passenger seat of that 1903 Ford. He was the Ford dealer in town for a while, among other things that he did. He's parked on West Main Street near where his studio was. Now, if you want to know where on West Main Street his studio was, if you know where Mel's is, directly across from the train station, it's where Mel's is. It's the same lot. In fact, Mel's has the same street address. Different building, of course. The building that the studio was in has long since disappeared. You know, we used to say that these photos were by Hallsinger himself, but we've learned in our research that in fact he had a large studio and employed up to 20 people, and some of the people he employed were photographers. And we know that especially in the period we're looking at, which is basically post 1912, he probably wasn't doing much of the photography at all. It was his employees who were doing the photography. Hallsinger was a real estate investor. He was a member of city council, where he, by the way, supported segregation ordinances. He was president of the Chamber of Commerce. He sat on the board of directors of a local bank. I mean, he was really busy, and it's unlikely that he was making most of the photographs that his studio produced after 1912. It was the photographers that he employed. So within his archive, within this Hallsinger studio archive, we have the Glee Club, you know, UVA students in blackface. We have these images of African Americans working at the menial job. Well, not menial. I used to be a cook, but I did. I spent 5 years as a restaurant cook. But these are not menial jobs, and in fact, to cook is a highly skilled job, but it doesn't pay well. So it's the low-paying jobs that African Americans were relegated to. Working on the railroad, also, you know, I don't think any one of us could have handled, you know, could do this job, right? And being a groom and handling the horses. Here we have a fraternity dinner, and you see the African Americans there along out in the back. They're the waiters. Yeah, you know. So within this archive of the Hallsinger studio, you know, we have these images that tell one kind of story. I'm going to go very briefly over this guy, Paul Barringer. He was instrumental in really building up the medical school here at UVA, eventually became president of Virginia Tech. But he was a notorious white supremacist and racist. And this book, The American Negro, it's really a pamphlet, but it had tremendous impact on American society. I'm just going to give you a taste of what he said. Scratch a Negro, find a savage. What sort of person is the African in America? We shall call him the West Coast African, the true Negro, the very lowest of the blacks. Let me hasten to say that Barringer didn't know anything about Africa. He knew nothing. He knew nothing. He's making this up. A feature of West Coast life was the absence of all restraint, either parental, social, or governmental. The child, the boy, the man followed only his own impulses. These were in time naturally cultivated to the basest of passions, with the results dishonesty and robbery, cruelty and murder, lust and rape. He was not an anthropologist. He knew nothing about Africa. He also knew he was lying. He was born into a wealthy Southern family. He had been raised by a black nanny. He might even have sucked at the breast of a black wet nurse. A black person had changed his diapers. A black person had cooked his meals. A black person had kissed his knee when he scraped his knee as a child. Black people did his laundry. When he grew up, black people did his cooking, kept his house. A black coachman drove him around in his carriage before he got an automobile. He knew he was lying, but he had to say that in the interest of white supremacy. And there was a lot of bad science. all kinds of bad science in the interest of white supremacy. You know, this is a book by a social scientist from 1914 where he's talking about the orthodoxy of the South as far as race is concerned. Blood will tell the white man must dominate. The Negro is inferior and will remain so. All the way down to number 14, let the lowest white man count for more than the highest Negro. I mean, this was conventional wisdom, right? And when we think about that visual culture, the visual culture is in service of white supremacy, right? Political and economic domination of the African-American community. But the African-American community was also fighting back. And those portraits that I showed earlier and that I'm going to get back to, those portraits were a weapon. You know, the late Bell Hooks wrote so powerfully about the importance of photography and the camera in African-American cultural life. In a world before racial integration, there was a constant struggle on the part of Black folks to create a counter-hegemonic world of images. A counter-hegemonic, a world of images that resisted racism and white supremacy, that would stand as visual resistance, challenging racist images. Though rarely articulated as such, and I'm not claiming that the people in these portraits consciously thought of it this way, rarely articulated as such, the camera became, in Black life, a political instrument, a way to resist racist representation, as well as a means by which alternative images could be produced. And sure enough, Black people have been doing this since the dawn of photography. Frederick Douglass, some people say, was the most photographed person of the 19th century, and he was the most photographed person of the 19th century in part because you know, he wanted to create a different image. He wanted to create a new way of seeing Black people for the world. Sojourner Truth, the great abolitionist, a former slave, also used photography in part to support her work as an abolitionist. So that you see her slogan there, I sell the shadow, I sell photograph to support the substance, to support me and my work. And well, this is definitely happening in Charlottesville. And so the Holzinger Archive is full of Black nannies with their white children, but you also see this, right? You also see the Black woman with her child. You see Horace Porter, an employee of the Hallsinger studio for at least 35 or 40 years. And we don't know exactly what he was doing, but we do know that he was a printer sometimes for the studio. And when Eugene Williams, the local civil rights leader, when Eugene Williams was a teenager, he worked very briefly for the Hallsinger studio just before World War II. And Horace Porter then was the darkroom technician. He was doing all the developing and all the printing. So a very skilled worker who helps to create these beautiful portraits of another Jefferson School graduate, Biola Green, who happens to be Horace Porter's future wife. Right, so here she is in 1916 as a Jefferson School graduate, and not a few years later, she'll be marrying Horace Porter, and they live a long life together. They both live into the 1980s. It's really remarkable. Here's Fannie Norris, beautifully dressed, very you know, people are self-conscious. They know how they want to be seen. She was a housemaid, but you look at her and you know she's not defined by being a housemaid. She's got other ideas about who she truly is. It's that autonomy, it's that sense of self-determination that we see in these portraits. We don't know a lot about everyone in the portraits. We're learning more, as I said, every day. Our research continues. But when we look at the gaze, when we look at the way they're presenting themselves to the camera and looking into the camera, you know, we see people who are silently asserting to whoever might see them, you are not who you think we are. Right? We are going to define ourselves. We are going to create a visual image of ourselves that's in such contradiction to all of these other kinds of stereotypes and demeaning cliches that inhabit American visual culture. You know, Henry McMahon and somebody that we know, must be his wife or his fiance. And sometimes you capture these incredibly beautiful gestures, like just holding hands like that. You know they did that spontaneously. The photographer didn't tell them to do it. It's just such this lovely thing that we have here. The Biggers family. I mean, you sense the pride, and and who would not be proud to have three cute little girls like this? I mean, they're just so wonderful. Many of the people who show up in these portraits were not middle class, were not people of wealth. We think these are three sisters. We haven't nailed it down. We do know that they are not wealthy women. We can see that from their clothing. But we look at the pride, look at the self-possession, look at the way that they are presenting themselves to the camera. And it's that life, it's that insistence that we are not going to be defined by Jim Crow. We're not going to be defined by oppression. We're not going to be defined by the racial terrorism which surrounds African Americans in America. No, we're going to define ourselves, and we're going to present ourselves in ways that reflect us. So Jessie White was a teacher at the Jefferson School. And one of the reasons that I like this particular portrait, it may not be the best portrait in the world, but she has on her lap sheet music. If you turn it upside down, it's easy to read. She's got this sheet music on her lap. And this tells us, by the way, that Black Charlottesvillians were absolutely in touch with the newest contemporary pop culture. So this is 1914. That's the year that this song was published. And why does she have sheet music? It's because recorded music was just coming in, and recorded music was really expensive. To buy a Victrola, one of those wind-up record players, it was like buying a giant screen color TV. I mean, it was the equivalent of thousands of dollars. So people played piano. That's how you made music. They played pianos, they played guitars, they played violins, they played mandolins, they played pianos. Amateur music making was really common. And so she was an amateur music maker, and she was up on the times. It's really great. This is another picture of the same Jessie White. And we really want to know who the soldier is. Now, this is 1919, and this is a time when returning soldiers came back in large numbers to have their portraits made. But this soldier wants to have his portrait made with Jessie White. Is that her fiance, her husband? Probably not her brother. We're going to find out. Bill Hurley. There are lots of ways of being a new Negro, and not every way of being a new Negro is to ape middle-class propriety. He's got other ideas about who he is. I'm going to skip over this because I'm running out of time, but we know a lot about Hurley. He enters the historical record. Fayette Johnson. He's actually from Stanton. So he's from, even further away than the next county over. But for some reason, here he is at the Hallsinger studio having his portrait made. One thing that's really interesting is that, why did the Daily Progress, even when it knew better, insist on publishing cartoons like this? Why? It knew that this was the African-American soldier. This is not the African-American soldier. But white supremacy demanded this vision, demanded that people see this as real. In any case, I keep talking about how people were very self-conscious about how they dressed and how they presented themselves to the camera. And it's great. And there's Cecilia Estes, very young, but very well dressed. And Golden Coles, who, by the way, has lots of descendants here in Charlottesville. Golden Coles worked for UVA. He's a teenager here. He's in his late teens. And look at that, spats and the hat and everything else. I mean, he's put together. And Daniel Brown had a little less money to put himself together, but he's also presenting himself. The slang was not to say hipster. The slang was not to say cool, but I don't know the slang. And so that's how he's presenting himself. This is to show you how large these images were. They were actually quite small. That's a pin, right next to the photo of Bertha Austin. And home ownership, you saw, this is a family in Kellytown. If you know where Trinity Episcopal Church is on Preston, Kellytown was behind where Trinity is now. It was an African-American enclave. And Zion Union in Vinegar Hill on 4th Street, basically where the parking lot for Staples is. Zion Union, of course, is now over on Preston as well. Black stores and barbers show up in our archive. And I always like to end or like to begin with this beautiful portrait of somebody that we haven't quite identified, but we think we will have her identified before September rolls around. We've got some really great clues, but it's, you know, it's the beauty of this photograph that draws us, especially that steady, self-possessed gaze into the camera's lens of this woman who's probably can't be more than 20, right? And yet that calm, that self-possession is really remarkable. And I think that's what's remarkable about all of these photographs, is that when you look at the photographs, you don't see all that horrible stuff that's swirling around the African-American community in the larger context. What you see are the rich, full, complex lives that African-Americans create for themselves. So, you know, this is a way into the history of Charlottesville, Albemarle, the surrounding counties, that doesn't start with oppression, but starts with beauty, that starts with style, that starts with family, that starts with community institutions like churches and schools, that starts with what we know about community organizing, the campaign to build a high school or get a high school built. You know, it starts not by centering oppression, but by centering a variety of other things. And, you know, we're lucky that these photographs exist because they give us a way of seeing the history of the city, the county, and the surrounding region in ways that I think are going to be very, very new. Okay, I'm sorry I talk so long, but it's an occupational hazard. One of the photographs that I showed you was a photograph of Bertha Austin that actually is a photograph that I own. And there she is. But what you can also see is how small these are, right? So I'm holding this just with my hand, and it's bigger than a playing card, but it's not much bigger than a playing card. The Hallsinger portraits could be had in a variety of different sizes and a variety of different styles. But the fact that you could get them this small made them available to poor people, made them available to people who didn't have a lot of money. Now, you still had to save up, and you probably had your portrait done once in your lifetime, or maybe twice. You didn't have it done very often, but you had it done. And you had it done by a professional, because amateur photography was still in its infancy. It was not very good. You could not get a nice portrait from an amateur, but you could from Hallsinger Studio. And so here we have Bertha Austin, and I'm so lucky to have this.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. Thank you so much. Is it all right if we take a few questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, wonderful. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box or the Q&A. I saw a couple that came in, so I'm going to go in the order in which they came in. This was asked a little earlier in the presentation. Where was the office of the Southern Aid Society? And there's a follow-up. Conley Greer of Riverview Farm worked for the SA Society before becoming the first African-American extension agent for Albemarle.
Wow, that's fantastic to hear. That's really great. I mean, that is really great, because the more local information we get, the better. It was on Preston. The Taylor's house, which was also the family residence, was on Preston near 10th. I can't tell you exactly where it was, but it was on Preston and it was near 10th.
Great, thank you. Oops.
Oh, the offices of the South. Yeah, that's the local office was on Preston near 10th. The headquarters was in Richmond.
Thank you. Here's a question I actually had too. This crossed my mind. How do you go about figuring out the people in these pictures?
We have records. They're not perfect records, but we have records. So we have names. And if you have a name, then you can go from there. So if we have a name, we go to the census, see if we can find, somebody who's basically the right age, right race, right place. City directories are very useful. There have been a variety of things that you can use. So let me just take Fayette Johnson. He was a soldier. Fayette Johnson, the soldier, his first name is Lafayette Johnson. So one of the first things we found out is that Fayette was his nickname. Through the census, we found out that he was born and raised in Stanton. We've got his military records about his service. We have his draft records. We can trace him to Pennsylvania, where he worked for one of the glass manufacturing companies. We can find out a lot about people. We can find these are all public records, right? We can find their birth certificates or birth records, death certificates, marriage certificates. For some people, if they're prominent, like Dr. Ferguson, they show up in newspapers. And since so many newspapers have been digitized now, it's easy to find mentions of people like Dr. Ferguson, although I have to say you have to be pretty prominent to show up in newspapers.
Great, thank you. Any more questions, please type them in the chat box or the Q&A. John, we were talking about this a little earlier. Where is this exhibit traveling to? I know that we've got a small portion of it here at Northside.
Oh.
Can you tell us a little bit more? How many
at Northside, it's just a teaser.
Right.
And so this is my chance to say that the Hallsinger studio had a fire in 1912. And everything the Hallsinger studio produced before 1912, almost everything that the studio produced before 1912 was lost into fire. So we have very little from before that. Hallsinger came to Charlottesville in the late 1880s. By the early 1890s, he's running a studio. He's very successful. He buys out a couple of his competitors. By the turn of the century, he has created the dominant photographic studio here in the city of Charlottesville. What the University of Virginia has are the glass plate negatives that were saved after the studio closed. So after old man Hallsinger died, his son, Ralph, took it over. And then when Ralph retired from the business, eventually the glass plate negatives were bought on behalf of the University of Virginia. So the University of Virginia has roughly 10,000 of these glass plate negatives. Of those 10,000 glass plate negatives, roughly 5,000 are portraits. And of the portraits, about 500 are of African Americans. So the African American portraits, while we've got a lot of them, we've got 500, that's still a small portion of the collection that's owned by UVA.
Thank you, John. I've had a couple more questions come in here. First one, are Elaine Locke, A-L-A-I-N, and Allen, A-L-L-E-N, Locke, one and the same person?
I don't know.
Okay, we'll move on to the next one.
I mean, research continues. I mean, we can't answer. I mean, and let me tell you, even though we have names of most of the African-American customers, the African-American clients of the Hallsinger studio, we don't have the names of all of them. And so there will be mysteries for sure.
Thank you, John. Another comment here. Dr. George Ferguson was buried in the Salmons family cemetery that was discovered in the proposed path of the Western Bypass.
It's good to know. It's really good to know.
Thank you. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions coming in. So John, I'm going to stop and thank you again for joining us this evening and for sharing
It's my pleasure, Evan.
the teaser
My
of this
pleasure.
wonderful exhibit here at the Northside Library. And I encourage everybody, it will be here until probably Friday afternoon. So you can stop by. If not, you'll have plenty of chances to see it in the future. Thank you, John. And thank
Well,
you.
Evan,
Yes.
let me just say that what's at Northside is the barest tip
Right.
of the iceberg.
Right.
You know, if it were an iceberg, it would be barely visible above the water surface, right? Because the exhibition that we're going to have in the fall is going to be doing so much more, so many more stories about the people's lives. We're going to be able to show you where they live. We're going to be able to, you know, embed them within the community and draw lines between relatives and friendships and where they worked and where they went to church. It's going to be a really rich history of this region, the city, Albemarle County, the surrounding counties, and it will open up to the national history of this country. You know, Booker T. Washington visited Charlottesville and had friends here. He stayed with the Inge family when he visited Charlottesville. When we talk about Booker T. Washington's impact, it's not just because he was a famous Black man, it's a famous Black man who spent time in Charlottesville. George W. Buckner, who wrote The New Negro in Charlottesville, piece that provoked the firestorm, you know, he eventually becomes very prominent in the Urban League, the civil rights organization. And he's in Tulsa, Oklahoma, only days after the Tulsa massacre in 1921. Only days after the massacre. He's there on behalf of the Urban League, bringing aid and relief to the African-American community. So these connections are really profound and really, really deep.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. And thank you everybody for attending this evening. Please check jmrl.org for a complete list of upcoming programs and events. And I hope everybody has a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.